The most feared man in the city stood frozen in his own hallway, staring at the roses in his maid's arms. He didn't ask who sent them. He took them, right out of her hands. And then he unleashed hell trying to find the man responsible. There was just one problem. There was no other man. Federico Grover was hunting himself, and he didn't even know it yet. What happens when the most dangerous man in the room is running from his own heart? Before this story begins, you need to know how it ends. Not the details. Those will unfold in their own time, with their own weight. But the truth at the center of it. Pride almost destroyed happiness. Hey everyone. Welcome back. I'm so grateful you're here with us again. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is there. We love connecting with our global family. And don't forget to like and subscribe. The kitchen was a different country from the rest of the Grover estate. Where the main house dealt in marble and mahogany and the aesthetic of intimidation, the kitchen had accumulated, over years of actual use, the lived-in quality that the rest of the house had been specifically designed to prevent. There were copper pots that had developed personalities. A worn patch on the floor in front of the stove where someone stood every morning. A windowsill above the sink where a small potted herb, rosemary, stubborn and fragrant, had been installed without permission and never removed because no one had ever quite gotten around to addressing it. Beatrice Harvey stood at that stove. She moved through the kitchen with the particular authority of someone who understood the space better than anyone else in the building. Not hurried. Not performative. Just competent, in the deepest sense of the word. A woman who knew exactly what she was doing and had long since stopped needing anyone to confirm it. She was in her uniform, her natural hair pulled back, and she was making coffee in the French press because the boss drank terrible instant coffee from a machine and someone had once, months ago, silently replaced the machine with a French press and a bag of good ground beans and not said a word about it. Federico Grover stopped in the kitchen doorway. She hadn't heard him yet. She was still humming, that quiet private sound, and her hands moved with easy confidence, pouring the hot water in the slow, deliberate spiral the process required. Steam rose in a thin column. The kitchen smelled of coffee and rosemary, and the particular warmth of a room that has been lived in since before dawn. He stood there for longer than he should have. Then his gaze moved, briefly, involuntarily, to her hands. She had careful hands. He had noticed this before, in the way he noticed things he had decided not to examine. Quickly once and then carefully not again. Her hands moved over the kitchen counter with a kind of quiet precision that he found, if he were honest, which he was not, inexplicably steadying. He cleared his throat. Beatrice looked up. Her expression did what it always did when he appeared unexpectedly. It composed itself. Not frightened, she was not frightened of him, which was something he had noticed and never commented on, but neutral. Professional. The hum stopped. "Mr. Grover," she said. Not a greeting. Not quite. An acknowledgement. "Miss Harvey." He walked through the kitchen toward the secondary hallway on the other side, as though this had always been his route, as though he had a specific destination. He was almost at the far doorway when he stopped. He didn't turn around. "Is there coffee?" A pause. The question was grammatically deficient. No inflection, no please. Technically not even a question. Beatrice looked at the French press in her hand. Then at his back. "There will be in 4 minutes," she said. Another pause. Then he walked out. Beatrice stood for a moment, looking at the doorway through which he'd disappeared. Then she looked at the French press. Then she set it down and went back to work, and the hum returned, quieter now, private in a different way. On the kitchen counter, near the corner where the rosemary sat in its unauthorized pot, there was a small cream envelope. It had been there when she arrived that morning, tucked against the base of the pot as though slipped there deliberately. She had noticed it 40 minutes ago, picked it up, read what was written inside. For the woman who makes this house feel like something. No name. No signature. She had read it twice, then a third time, then placed it carefully in the front pocket of her apron. She had been thinking about it in the background all morning, the way you think about something that might be meant for you but that you don't quite allow yourself to claim. Probably a mistake. A misdelivery. These things happened. She pressed her palm briefly against the pocket where the cards sat and went back to the coffee. At 8:17, the doorbell rang. Beatrice was closest. She wiped her hands on a clean cloth and walked through the utility corridor to the staff entrance at the side of the house, which was where deliveries came. She opened the door. A young man stood on the step, uniformed in the green and white of a florist's service, holding an arrangement so extraordinary that for a moment Beatrice simply stared at it. Red roses, deep, saturated red, the color of something meant, arranged with eucalyptus and white ranunculus, wrapped in craft paper and tied with a ribbon the color of dark wine. There were at least 24 of them. Perhaps more. The young man looked at his delivery sheet. Beatrice Harvey? The name, spoken aloud, in connection with the flowers, did something unexpected to the air in Beatrice's chest. Yes, she said carefully. These are for you. Happy Valentine's Day. She took them. They were heavier than she expected. She looked down at the small card attached to the ribbon, her name, written in a neat hand, and felt something she hadn't felt in this house before. Something she hadn't expected to feel here, in this cold and marble place where she was staff and furniture and background. She felt very suddenly seen. She looked up to thank the delivery boy, and when she turned back toward the interior of the house, the flowers cradled in her arms, she found herself looking directly at Federico Grover. He had come back for the coffee. He stood in the hallway at the junction between the utility corridor and the main entrance, perfectly still, and he was looking at the flowers in her arms with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It moved through 3 stages in the space of 4 seconds. First, something that might, in another man, have been recognized as recognition. A flicker of something known. Then, the swift, deliberate burial of it. Then, fury. Not loud. Not explosive. Not yet. But the temperature in the hallway changed the way it changes before something breaks, and Beatrice, who had learned in this house to read the quality of silences, understood with sudden cold clarity that the beautiful flowers in her arms had just become the most complicated thing in the building. Federico's fingers found his cufflink. And held. The hallway had a particular quality of silence in that moment. Not the ordinary silence of a large house in mourning. Not the settled, ambient quiet of marble floors and high ceilings absorbing the small sounds of the world going about its business. This was a different kind of silence. The kind that gathers in the second before something irreversible happens. The kind that has weight and temperature and intention. Federico Grover had not moved. He stood at the junction of the utility corridor and the main hallway, and he was looking at the flowers the way a man looks at something that has just walked through a wall he was certain was solid. His expression had completed its 3-stage journey and arrived at its destination, that cold, specific fury, and it sat on his face with the settled authority of something that had been there before and knew exactly where to put itself. Beatrice felt it before she fully understood it. She had worked in this house for 14 months. In that time she had developed the particular fluency that domestic staff develop in the homes of difficult men, an almost somatic understanding of the atmosphere, a sensitivity to the small signals that preceded larger events. She could read the quality of Federico Grover's silences the way a sailor reads water. And the silence coming off him right now was not a weather pattern she had encountered before. It was something older. Something personal. She adjusted the bouquet in her arms, a small reflexive gesture, the flowers suddenly feeling precarious, and met his gaze. "Mr. Grover," she said. The same tone she'd used that morning. Neutral. Measured. But something in her voice had shifted almost imperceptibly, The way a tone shifts when the person speaking it is not quite sure what they are walking into. He crossed the hallway toward her. His walk was the same as it always was. Unhurried, deliberate, the walk of a man who had never needed to rush because the world rearranged itself in advance of his arrival. But there was something underneath it now. A compression. The sense of something being held very tightly in check. He stopped in front of her. Close enough that she had to look up slightly to maintain eye contact. His gaze moved from her face to the flowers and back. Who sent those? Again. Not a question. A demand with a question syntax. His voice was the same voice he'd used on the phone that morning. Flat, quiet, and carrying the specific weight of a man accustomed to receiving answers. Beatrice held his gaze. I don't know. You don't know. He repeated it without inflection, as though the words had come back to him in a language he didn't trust. There was a card, she said carefully, with my name, but no sender's name. Something moved through his expression. Gone before she could name it. Show me the card. It was in that moment, standing in the hallway of a house she cleaned for a living, holding flowers that were hers, being asked to produce evidence of her own delivery, that Beatrice felt the first press of something that was not quite fear and not quite anger but lived in the territory between them. She had been asked in this house and others, to make herself smaller in 100 different ways. To speak less. To take up less space. To need less. She had complied, because compliance was survival, because she was practical and unsentimental about the arithmetic of power. But the flowers were hers. She reached into her apron pocket and produced the small card that had come attached to the ribbon. She held it out. Federico took it. His fingers were precise and controlled, but she noticed, because she noticed things, had trained herself to notice things, that the tendons in the back of his hand were visible. He was holding something very tightly in his body that had nothing to do with the card. He read it. Because you deserve to be seen. R. The hallway temperature dropped 2 degrees. Beatrice was nearly certain of it. His jaw set. His eyes came up from the card with a new quality in them. Focused, the way eyes focus when they have located a target. He read the card a second time. Slower. His thumb pressed against the initial at the bottom. Ah. Who is R? He said. I don't know anyone by that initial, Beatrice said. I assumed it might be a mistake. A misdelivery. Your name was on the delivery sheet. Yes. Then it wasn't a misdelivery. She had nothing to say to that, because he was correct. What happened next took less than 10 seconds and rearranged the entire morning. Federico reached out and took the bouquet from her arms. Not roughly. That was the thing she would turn over later, in the quiet of her room, when she was trying to make sense of it. He didn't snatch them or knock them from her hands. He took them with the calm, absolute certainty of a man removing an object from a space where it did not belong, the same way he might remove a weapon from a room, or a document from the wrong hands. Deliberate. Controlled. As though the action were entirely reasonable. The flowers were in his hands. Her arms were empty. Beatrice looked at her empty arms. Then she looked at him. He was already turning the bouquet, examining the craft paper wrapping, checking the base of the arrangement for a florist's mark with the focused attention of someone running an investigation. He found it, a small green stamp at the base of the wrapping. Rosario's Florals. He looked at it for 2 seconds. Filed it away. Then he looked up and found Beatrice's expression. If he had expected deference, the dropped gaze, the small contraction of self that had been, in his experience, the predictable response of people in his employ when he exercised the authority that came with being Federico Grover, he did not find it. Beatrice was looking at him with an expression of such controlled and specific displeasure that it briefly gave him pause. She was not shouting. She would not shout. She was too composed for that, and they both knew it. But her eyes were doing something that shouting could not have achieved. They were making him accountable. Standing in his own hallway, with her flowers in his hands, under the steady regard of a woman who cleaned his floors, Federico Grover felt something he had not felt in a considerable amount of time. He felt looked at. He set the bouquet on the hall table behind him. The roses, still wrapped in their craft paper and dark wine ribbon, lay against the mahogany surface like something stranded. "I'll need to know who delivered these," he said. His voice was completely level. "For security purposes." "Security purposes," Beatrice repeated. "Unverified deliveries to staff are a liability." The silence that followed this statement was extraordinary. It was the silence of a woman who had a great deal to say and was making a precise and deliberate choice about how much of it to release. "I see," she said finally. 2 words. They carried the weight of a much longer sentence. From somewhere deeper in the house, Tomas materialized, as Tomas tended to do at moments of significant atmospheric pressure, appearing at the far end of the hallway with the expression of a man who has assessed a situation in under 3 seconds and chosen his position carefully. Federico turned to him. "Rosario's Florals. I want the order details for this delivery. Who placed it, what name, what payment method. By this afternoon." Tomas's gaze moved, briefly, involuntarily, from his boss to Beatrice to the flowers on the hall table to his boss again. Something passed through his face that he immediately controlled. "Understood." Federico straightened his jacket, touched his cufflink, and walked away down the main corridor with the bearing of a man who had handled a situation and was moving on to the next one. Tomas watched him go. Then he looked at Beatrice. She was still standing in the hallway, in the spot where her flowers had been taken from her arms, and she was looking not at the bouquet on the table and not at the direction Federico had gone but at a fixed middle point in the air in front of her, with the expression of someone organizing a very large and complicated feeling into something manageable. Her hands, Tomas noticed, were completely still at her sides. That stillness, somehow, was the most expressive thing in the room. He opened his mouth, closed it. What was there to say? He was a practical man. "I'll get you some water for those," he said finally, nodding toward the flowers on the table. "Roses dry out fast." Beatrice looked at him, then at the bouquet. Then she walked to the hall table, picked up her flowers, and held them against her chest. "Thank you, Mr. Rell," she said quietly. "I'll see to them myself." She walked back toward the kitchen. And in the kitchen doorway, before she passed through it, she stopped. Without turning around, in a voice that was perfectly measured and carried exactly as far as it needed to carry, she said, "Those were mine." The hallway held the words after she was gone. Tomas stood alone in the corridor, looking at the space where she had been, and then looking at the direction his boss had gone, and he pressed his lips together in the expression of a man who is watching a situation move toward a very predictable and very avoidable catastrophe, and has made the professional calculation that it is not yet his place to intervene. He went to find out about the flowers. And in the main corridor, 20 feet away and already on another call, Federico Grover walked with his usual authority and his usual composure, and his right hand had found his left cufflink and was pressing it, once, twice, 3 times, with a regularity that was not usual at all. The card was still in his jacket pocket. "Because you deserve to be seen." He had not given it back. Federico Grover's study was the most honest room in the Grover estate. Not because it was warm. It wasn't. Not because it was personal in any decorative sense. It contained no photographs displayed openly, no inherited artwork chosen for sentiment, no objects arranged for the comfort of visitors. It was honest in the way that a working room is honest. It showed what a man actually did with his hours, rather than what he wanted people to think he did with them. There were files. There were maps with notations in his precise handwriting. There was a desk that had the particular worn quality of a surface used for real work, and a chair that had been replaced twice in 9 years because Federico Grover sat in it for 12 hours a day, and chairs, unlike men, were permitted to show their exhaustion. He was behind that desk now. The card was in front of him. Because you deserve to be seen. R. He had placed it on the desk blotter when he entered the study, and he had been looking at it, between phone calls, between the movement of files across his desk, between the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday morning in February, with the focused attention of a man who has decided that a piece of paper is a problem requiring a solution. The thing about Federico Grover and problems was this: he was exceptionally good at solving them. He had built an empire on that capability. He understood leverage and weakness and the architecture of other people's motivations with a fluency that most men spend entire careers trying to develop. He could look at a situation, identify its pressure points, and apply exactly the right force in exactly the right place. What he was not good at, what he had, in fact, spent the better part of his adult life engineering his existence to avoid, was problems that lived inside his own chest. Those he tended to externalize. He picked up his phone. Tomas. Already on it. Tomas's voice carried the faint quality of a man working while standing. Rosario's Florals, correct? Order details. Everything they have. Payment method, name on the order, date placed. Whether it was a walk-in or phone order or online. Whether anyone accompanied the purchaser if it was in-store. A brief pause. That's going to require some persuasion. Florists aren't typically forthcoming with. Tomas. I'll have it by afternoon. Federico set the phone down. He looked at the card again. His thumb moved toward it, stopped. He turned it face down on the blotter. It didn't help. He stood and walked to the window. His study overlooked the west garden, dormant in February, the rose bushes cut back to their bare structural bones, the stone path swept clean. He stood there with his hands clasped behind his back and looked at nothing in particular and thought about the letter R with a concentration that would have been, to any outside observer, entirely disproportionate to the situation. Ah! The name surfaces in his mind the way names do when you are trying to locate a threat. Scrolling through a mental index of associates, rivals, enemies, acquaintances. Federico's index was long and meticulously maintained. He moved through it methodically. Rafael Cuesta. No. Rafael was in Barcelona and had no connection to the estate. Roberto Vane. Possible. Vane had been making overtures about the Eastern District for 3 months, and using a woman to establish a foothold in Federico's household would not be beneath him. Renzo Marchetti. The thought arrived with a particular sharpness. Renzo was the younger brother of the man Federico had spoken to on the phone that morning. The unresolved Marchetti matter. Federico had dismissed it as a business complication. But if Renzo was also moving on the personal front, he stopped himself. He was aware, in a distant and uncomfortable way, that he was doing something. Building a case. Generating suspects. Treating the romantic inclinations of an anonymous admirer as though they were an act of warfare. He was aware that this response was, by any reasonable metric, outsized. He was also aware that he was not going to stop. Because the alternative, the thing that lived on the other side of stopping, was an acknowledgement he was not prepared to make in the light of a February morning or any other light. He went back to his desk. In the laundry room on the lower level of the estate, Beatrice Harvey was doing what Beatrice Harvey did when she needed to think. She worked. The laundry room was warm and smelled of detergent and the faint mineral scent of heated water, and she moved through it with the same quiet authority she brought to every room in this house, sorting and folding with the methodical precision of someone who found a specific comfort in physical tasks performed well. Her hands knew what to do without instruction, which left her mind free to do what it had been doing since 8:17 that morning. Turning over the card. She had retrieved it from her apron pocket when she came downstairs. It was slightly creased now from being handled. She had smoothed it against her palm before placing it on top of the folding table, where she could see it while she worked. For the woman who makes this house feel like something. She had worked in 4 houses before the Grover estate. A family in the suburbs, pleasant, unremarkable, the husband who always forgot her name and the wife who compensated by using it too frequently, with a faint aggression of someone making a point. A bachelor apartment where she had lasted 6 months before the atmosphere became something she didn't want to breathe anymore. A diplomat's residence. Formal, correct, treating her with a precise courtesy that was somehow more alienating than rudeness because it required nothing of either party. And then this place. This cold, marble, magnificent, difficult, silent place where the man at the center of it moved through rooms like weather and the staff navigated around him the way ships navigate around something they cannot map. She had been here 14 months. She had learned the house's rhythms and the boss's habits and the specific grammar of existing in a space where you were necessary but not quite seen. And then someone had written those words on a card and left them on her counter. For the woman who makes this house feel like something. She pressed her palm flat against the card. Someone in this house had been paying attention. Had seen specifically what she did and what it cost and what it created. The warmth she brought to the kitchen, the order she maintained, the small details that accumulated into the thing this house called running smoothly, but that were in fact the result of one person caring deeply and quietly about a place that had never been asked to care back. Someone had noticed. She picked up the card and put it back in her pocket. A voice from the doorway. "You're going to wear that thing out." Beatrice looked up. Celia Marsh stood in the laundry room doorway with a stack of pressed linens balanced against her hip, and the expression of a woman who had been observing human nature for 61 years and had developed strong opinions about what she saw. Celia had worked at the Grover estate for a decade, longer than anyone else on staff, long enough to remember the previous iteration of the house and to have formed, in that time, the specific immunity to Federico Grover's atmosphere that only long exposure could produce. "I'm not wearing anything out," Beatrice said. "You've checked that pocket 4 times since you came downstairs." Celia set her linens on the sorting table and began separating them with practiced efficiency. The flowers were beautiful, by the way. Before he took them. A pause. Deliberate. "I haven't seen him take anything from a staff member's hands in 10 years here." "It was a security concern," Beatrice said. Her voice was perfectly level. Celia made a sound that was not a word. It communicated volumes. "Miss Celia." "In 10 years," Celia continued as though Beatrice had not spoken, "I have seen that man walk through this house like a force of nature and pay attention to almost nothing that wasn't directly related to his business. He doesn't notice the flowers on the dining table. Doesn't notice when the furniture gets rearranged. Walked past a broken window in the East Corridor for 11 days before anyone thought to mention it to him." She paused her sorting. Looked at Beatrice directly. "But he noticed yours." The laundry room was warm. Beatrice was aware of the card in her pocket. "That's not," she started. "Think about what that means," Celia said simply. She picked up her sorted linens and walked out. Beatrice stood in the warm detergent-scented air of the laundry room and looked at the doorway Celia had just walked through. Then she looked down at the folding table. Then she pressed her hand against her apron pocket, just briefly, just for a moment, and went back to work. But her hands, for the first time that morning, were not quite steady. Upstairs, the afternoon delivered Tomas to Federico's study door at 3:47 with a manila folder and the careful expression of a man carrying information he isn't entirely sure how to present. Federico looked up from his desk. "Rosario's Florals," Tomas said, and placed the folder on the desk. Federico opened it. Inside was a printed order form, the kind that florists generate when an order is placed online. It was thorough. Item description, delivery address, special instructions, payment record. Federico's eyes moved through it with the speed of a man accustomed to extracting relevant information from documents quickly. Delivery address. The Grover Estate, staff entrance. Attention. Beatrice Harvey. Order placed, December 28th. 6 weeks ago. Payment. Cash deposit. In-store. Name on order. R. Voss. Federico looked at the name. R. Voss. He said it silently, testing it. Turned it over. The R again, landing with that same sharpening of focus. And Voss, not a name he recognized, not from any family, not from any associate list in his mental index. A clean name. A deliberately unremarkable name. The kind of name a person chose when they didn't want to be found. R. Voss, he said aloud. Doesn't match anyone in our network, Tomas confirmed. I ran it. Clean name, no records, no known associates, no connection to any family or operation I can find. Could be an alias. It is an alias, Federico said. Nobody is named R. Voss. Tomas didn't respond to that. He was looking at the folder with an expression Federico didn't examine. The payment. Cash. In-store. So someone walked into Rosario's Florals in late December and placed this order in person. Yes. Pull the surrounding security footage. The florist shop will have cameras. Also check the street outside. There are city cameras on that block. Tomas was quiet for a moment. Then, boss. It could be nothing. A staff member's friend, someone who met her outside the house. Who deposits cash for flowers under a fake name for someone they met casually? Tomas had no answer for that. Because the answer, if examined honestly, was someone who doesn't want to be identified. And the reason a person didn't want to be identified when sending flowers was either that they were hiding their identity from the recipient, which argued for an anonymous admirer, which was hardly a threat, or that they were hiding their identity from someone else in the recipient's life. Federico appeared to be operating on the second interpretation. Tomas filed this observation away. I'll request the footage, he said. He was almost at the door when Federico said, There's a second document. Tomas stopped. Sir. In the folder. There were 2 pages. Tomas turned. He looked at the folder on the desk. He looked at Federico. Something in his expression shifted. Almost nothing, almost invisible. But Federico Grover had spent 9 years learning to read Tomas Rel. The second page, Federico said again quietly. What is it? Tomas crossed back to the desk. He reached into the folder and produced a second printed sheet. Slightly different paper, a receipt rather than an order form. He placed it beside the first. Federico looked at it. It was a cancellation receipt. Same order number as the first document. Same florist. Same delivery address. Same name. R. Voss. Cancelled. January 3rd. 6 days after the original order was placed. There was a notation in the special instructions field of the cancellation. Do not redeliver. Do not contact. Federico read the cancellation receipt. He read it again. The study was very quiet. The florist says it was a system error, Tomas said, carefully. The cancellation processed on their end, but the order remained active in the delivery queue. It went out this morning automatically. A pause. They've offered to leave it, Federico said. His voice was different. Not the cold, controlled fury of the morning. Something else. Something that, if Tomas had been asked to name it, he might have called, carefully, privately, only to himself, caught. Tomas looked at his boss. At the 2 documents side by side on the desk. At the order placed 6 weeks ago and the cancellation placed 6 days later, and the notation in handwriting that Tomas had seen on 100 documents over 9 years and recognized as clearly as he recognized his own. Do not redeliver. Do not contact. He had known since the moment he pulled both documents from the florist's records. He had known, and he had said nothing, because it was not yet his place. But he looked at Federico now, at the man sitting behind his desk with both documents in front of him and his face doing something that Federico Grover's face almost never did. And he made the professional calculation that it was still not his place, but that it would be soon. Should I continue with the footage request? Tomas asked. The question sat in the air. Federico's right hand moved, found the edge of the desk. His fingers pressed against the wood. Yes, he said. His voice was completely steady. His face had completed its journey back to the controlled, unreadable surface that the world knew. He picked up the cancellation receipt, looked at it for one more moment, then placed it back in the folder and closed it. Find our Voss, he said. By morning. Tomas nodded, picked up the folder, walked to the door. He had his hand on the door frame when Federico spoke again. His voice was so low that Tomas almost didn't catch it. Tomas. Sir. A long pause. The study held its breath. The roses. Did Miss Harvey put them in water? Tomas stood very still in the doorway. Yes, he said after a moment. She did. Federico nodded once. Said nothing more. Tomas walked out and pulled the door closed behind him, and in the corridor he stood for exactly 3 seconds with the folder in his hands and an expression on his face that no one was there to see. Something between exasperation and a very specific, very private kind of fondness for a man who was being profoundly, spectacularly, almost impressively foolish. Then he straightened his jacket and went to find the security footage of a florist shop he already knew would show him nothing useful. Inside the study, Federico Grover sat behind his desk in the fading February light with his hands flat on the closed folder and his cufflinks untouched and something moving through him that he had not yet named and was not yet willing to name. The card was still in his jacket pocket. Because you deserve to be seen. He stood, walked to the window, looked out at the bare winter garden. His hands, behind his back, were perfectly still. The Grover estate had a specific rhythm at night. By 9 o'clock, the main house settled into its evening configuration. The formal rooms closed off, the lighting reduced to the functional minimum. The staff who lived off-premises departed through the side entrance with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that their continued presence after hours required justification. The house became smaller at night, more navigable, stripped of the daytime choreography that kept everyone in their designated orbits. Federico was usually in his study until midnight. Sometimes later. The kitchen, by 9 o'clock, was typically empty. Beatrice Harvey worked Tuesdays differently. Tuesday was the one day she stayed late, not because anyone had asked her to, not because it was written into her employment terms, but because Wednesday morning was the most logistically complicated morning in the household week, and Beatrice had learned in her first month that the difference between a Wednesday that ran smoothly and a Wednesday that didn't was almost entirely determined by what happened in the kitchen on Tuesday night. Prep work. Stock checks. The slow, methodical organization of a space, so that the morning could move without friction. She found satisfaction in this. In the quiet competence of preparation. In the particular piece of a kitchen at night, the main house gone still around her, the overhead lights dim to the warmer secondary setting, the only sounds the soft percussion of her own work and the occasional voice of the February wind finding the gaps around the window frames. She was at the counter, working through the prep list, when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside the kitchen. She recognized them. She would have known Federico Grover's footsteps in any corridor of this house. Their particular weight and rhythm had become, over 14 months, as familiar to her as the sound of the boiler cycling or the creak of the third stair. What was unusual was their direction. His study was in the east wing. The kitchen was at the back of the house. There was no business of his, at 9:15 on a Tuesday evening, that would bring him down this corridor. And yet, he appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was still in his suit, The charcoal one from this morning, jacket still on, which told her he had not been upstairs since the afternoon. His tie had been loosened by approximately 2 centimeters, which on Federico Grover constituted a significant concession to the hour. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither spoke for a moment that lasted slightly longer than comfort required. Then he walked in and sat down. Not at the small staff table in the corner. The appropriate seat, the one that maintained the correct geometry of employer and employee. He sat at the kitchen counter, on the stool at the end nearest the window, the one that Celia sometimes occupied on the rare mornings when she arrived early enough to share the first coffee of the day. He placed both hands flat on the counter in front of him, and looked at nothing in particular with the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere without entirely deciding to come. Beatrice looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to her prep work. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was not hostile either. It occupied a third category, loaded, attentive, the silence of two people who were aware of each other with an acuteness that had nothing to do with proximity, and everything to do with the unfinished business that the day had deposited between them like furniture neither had asked for and both had to navigate around. She was chopping herbs when he spoke. "Do you always stay this late on Tuesdays?" His voice was different from his daytime voice. Not softer exactly. Federico Grover's voice did not do soft, but less compressed. As though the specific tension that he carried during business hours had, in the diminished light of the kitchen at 9 o'clock, released a fraction of its grip. "Every Tuesday," she said. She did not look up from the herbs. "For how long?" "Since my 3rd week." He absorbed this. She could feel him doing it, the particular quality of attention he gave information, the way he filed things. "Why?" She looked up then, briefly. "Because Wednesday mornings run better when Tuesday nights are organized." He said nothing, but something in his face shifted almost imperceptibly, the faint movement of a man registering something he hadn't considered before. "No one asked you to." "No," she agreed. "They didn't." Another silence. She moved from the herbs to the stock, checking the levels with the focused efficiency of someone running through a list in their head. He watched her hands. She was aware of him watching her hands, the same way she had been aware of it this morning in the kitchen, and the same way she had been aware of it on a dozen other mornings before that. Those brief passages where he moved through the kitchen on his inexplicable route and paused, and his eyes went to her hands, and then he left without acknowledging that any of it had happened. "Who do you think sent them?" he said. The question arrived without preamble, without the warning of a preceding sentence to signal it was coming. It landed in the kitchen air with the bluntness of something that had been held back for several hours and had finally run out of patience. Beatrice set down the ladle she was holding. She turned to face him fully. He was looking at her with that direct, undefended attention, and she understood, with the particular intelligence of a woman who has learned to read rooms and people and the space between what is said and what is meant, that this question was not the question it appeared to be. He was not asking out of continued suspicion. He was not asking as part of an investigation. He was asking the way a person asks a question when the answer matters to them personally and they lack, at this moment, the architecture to say so directly. She decided to be honest. "I don't know," she said. But whoever it was, they were paying attention. "That card," she stopped, considered how much to give. It was specific. Not a generic Valentine message. It was about this house. About what I do here. Federico's jaw moved. Barely perceptible. "You think they know you?" "I think they see me," she said. The distinction was deliberate. Those aren't always the same thing. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the February wind moved through the bare garden. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, not the controlled authority of business hours, not the cold fury of the morning, not the careful neutrality he deployed in most human interactions. Something else. something that had come to the surface in the low light of the kitchen and was not, for once, being immediately suppressed. "Do you like roses?" he said. The question arrived the same way the previous one had, without preparation, without the softening of context. But this one landed differently. It was too quiet, too specific. It had none of the operational justification of the earlier question. It was simply a man asking a woman a simple question in a kitchen at night, and its simplicity was precisely what made it so disorienting. Beatrice looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze with the steadiness of a man who had committed to the question and was not going to retreat from it. "I don't get many flowers," she said finally. Her voice was careful, honest. "So yes, I think I do." The thing that moved through his expression in the half-second after she finished speaking was gone before she could name it. But it had been there. She had seen it. And in 14 months of learning to read this man's carefully controlled surface, she had learned that the things that moved through his expression and disappeared were usually the most true things about him. She turned back to the counter. He stayed. That was the thing she noted, and kept noting as the minutes passed. He stayed. He sat at the kitchen counter and watched her work and occasionally asked a question that had none of the operational purposefulness of his usual conversation, and everything of simple curiosity. He asked how long she had worked in kitchens. She told him since she was 16, starting in her aunt's catering business, learning the architecture of food preparation before she could articulate what she was learning. He asked if she'd trained formally. She said no. She'd been offered a place at a culinary program at 22 and turned it down because the tuition had been impossible and the timing had been worse. "Would you go back?" he asked. "If you could." She considered this. "I think what I do now is different from what that program would have made me. I'm not sure the trade would be worth it." He nodded. Once. As though this answer had confirmed something. "What about you?" she said. It came out before she'd fully decided to say it. She registered the slight recklessness of the question. Asking a Mafia boss about his vocational history at 9:30 on a Tuesday night, but she did not retract it. He looked at her. Something that might, on another face, have been amusement moved through his expression. "What about me?" he said. "Is this what you would have chosen? If you'd been offered a different path at 16? The kitchen held the question. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "No," he said. Simply. Without elaboration or self-pity. Just the single syllable, honest in the way of something stated rather than confessed. She nodded. Did not push. They stayed in that for a moment, two people who had told each other small true things in a warm kitchen at night, and the atmosphere between them was so entirely different from everything the day had been that it had a slightly unreal quality, as though they had both stepped briefly through a door that was not usually available to them. Then his phone rang. The sound was a physical intrusion, loud in the kitchen, quiet, insistent, the specific ringtone he reserved for the calls that required immediate response. He straightened on the stool. His face went through its familiar transformation. The compression returning, the softness gone, Federico Grover reassembling himself in real time. He was off the stool and reaching for his phone in one motion. "Grover." His voice was back to its daytime register. Flat. Authoritative. The kitchen might as well not have existed. He was already moving toward the doorway, his attention fully transferred to whoever was on the other end of the call, his body language communicating the absolute completeness of his focus shift. He paused at the doorway, back to her, and his free hand moved to the counter beside him. His fingers found a mug. Her mug. Still warm, the one she'd made for herself 30 minutes ago and not yet finished. He picked it up. Registered, half a second later, what he had done. Set it back down precisely where it had been. "I need those numbers before midnight," he said into the phone, and walked out. Beatrice looked at the mug. At the doorway. At the mug again. She picked it up. Wrapped both hands around it. The ceramic was warm. Footsteps in the corridor. Lighter than Federico's. The quick efficient tread of someone who moved through this house the way fish move through water. Celia appeared in the kitchen doorway, coat on, bag over her shoulder, clearly on her way out through the side entrance. She stopped. Looked at Beatrice standing at the counter with both hands wrapped around her mug, staring at the doorway Federico had just vacated. Looked at the empty stool at the counter. Looked at Beatrice again. Her expression was the expression of a woman who has been correct about something for a very long time and has just received confirmation. "Miss Celia," Beatrice said before she could speak. "Don't." Celia smiled. Small, private. The smile of someone who doesn't need to say anything because everything has already been said. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder. "Good night, Beatrice," she said. And walked out. The side door closed with a soft click. Beatrice stood alone in the kitchen, both hands around her warm mug, and she was doing the thing she had told herself she would not do. The thing she had been disciplined enough to avoid for 14 months in this house. She was allowing herself to think about him. Not as the employer. Not as the difficult, controlled, cold presence that structured her working days. But as the man who had sat at her kitchen counter at 9:15 on a Tuesday night and asked her if she liked roses. She set the mug down. Reached into her apron pocket. The card was still there. Slightly more worn now from the day's handling. For the woman who makes this house feel like something. She read it one more time. Then she looked toward the doorway where he had gone, and she let herself wonder, just for a moment, just in the quiet of the kitchen with no one to see it, whether the man who had written those words and the man who had sat on that stool tonight were, in fact, the same person. She pressed the card flat against her palm. "Tomorrow," she said quietly to no one, "the truth will surface." She didn't know how right she was. The next morning arrived gray and cold over the Grover estate, the kind of February morning that felt like the world withholding something. Tomas knocked on the study door at 8 o'clock precisely. Federico was already behind his desk. He had been there since 6, which told Tomas everything about the quality of the night his boss had experienced. There were 2 documents in the manila folder Tomas carried, and he placed them on the desk without ceremony because there was no ceremony appropriate for what they contained. Federico opened the folder. The first page was the order form from Rosario's Florals. He had seen it already. His eyes moved through it quickly. Delivery address, Beatrice Harvey, order placed December 28th, payment cash, name R. Voss, and settled on the second page. The cancellation receipt. Same order number. Same florist. Same delivery address. Cancelled. January 3rd. 6 days after placement. And in the special instructions field of the cancellation, in handwriting that required no forensic analysis to identify, for words that constituted the most self-incriminating thing Federico Grover had ever committed to paper. Do not redeliver. Do not contact. The study was completely silent. Federico sat with both documents in front of him, and did not move for a very long time. The full weight of what he had done descended in layers, each one arriving with its own particular quality of devastation. He had ordered the flowers. In late December, in a moment of something he had not examined and still wasn't ready to name, he had sat at his desk and placed an order for an extraordinary bouquet under a fake name because his own name, his actual name, the name he had built 30 years of authority around, was too terrifying to attach to an act of tenderness directed at a woman who cleaned his floors. Then he had panicked. 6 days later, the cowardice had won, and he had called Rosario's Florals and cancelled the order and told them not to redeliver and not to contact anyone, because if no flowers arrived then nothing had to be acknowledged and nothing had to change in the particular equilibrium of his life. Ordered, controlled, emotionally uninhabited, could continue undisturbed. And then a florist's administrative error had delivered the flowers anyway. and then he had taken them from her hands. He pressed both palms flat against the desk. Tomas said from the doorway, "The cancellation notation. I recognized the handwriting when I pulled the documents." A pause. "I thought you should see it yourself." Federico said nothing. "Boss." Tomas's voice was careful. "She still has the roses. She put them in water yesterday. They're in the kitchen window." Federico looked up. Through his study window, at an angle, past the west garden's bare geometry, he could see the edge of the kitchen window. And in it, barely visible, a suggestion of color against the gray February morning. Red. He exhaled. He looked like a man who had survived a great many things and had not expected this to be the one that undid him. "She's going to leave," he said. His voice was very quiet. "When she finds out what I did, she'll leave." "Why would she leave?" "Because I took flowers from her hands, Tomas. In front of everyone. I interrogated her. I sent you after a ghost." He stopped. "I treated her like she had done something wrong." Tomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "Like she was invisible?" The word arrived like a verdict. Federico received it without flinching because he deserved it without flinching. He looked at the cancellation receipt. At his own handwriting. At the 4 words he had written in January to protect himself from the consequences of caring about someone. Do not redeliver. Do not contact. Outside the kitchen window, the roses were red against the gray morning sky. He stood up. He found the bouquet still on the hall table where he had left it the previous morning, slightly diminished by 24 hours without water, the outermost petals beginning their slow retreat toward the edges. He picked it up, carried it to the kitchen. Beatrice was at the stove. She heard him come in and turned, and when she saw the bouquet in his hands, her expression moved through a rapid sequence of responses before settling into careful neutrality. He held the flowers out. "They were yours," he said. 3 words. She heard something in them, a weight, a register, that she couldn't immediately account for. She looked at the flowers. At him. At the flowers again. She took them. Their hands were close in the exchange, neither pulling away with the deliberate speed of people maintaining professional distance. For a moment they were simply 2 people standing close together in a kitchen, holding either end of a bouquet of roses, and the morning light came through the window and fell across both of them without distinction. "Thank you," she said quietly. He sat down at the counter. "The stool from last night." Her stool, Celia's stool, the stool that had apparently become, in the quiet renegotiation of territory that happens between people who are circling something, his stool now. She made coffee. He didn't ask for it. She made it anyway. What followed was 20 minutes that neither of them would be entirely able to account for afterward. A conversation that moved through small true things the way water moves through stone, gradually, persistently, wearing something smooth. He told her that the rosemary on her windowsill had been there so long it had effectively become structural. She told him that if anyone removed it she would consider it a hostile act. Something moved through his expression that was, unmistakably, the beginning of a smile. She laughed, surprised out of herself by it, and the sound of it in the kitchen was so entirely unguarded that Tomas, passing in the corridor outside, stopped walking and stood very still for a moment, as though afraid that moving might disturb something fragile. Federico was watching her when she laughed. He was not trying to hide that he was watching her. That too was new. "You should eat breakfast," she said when the laughter had settled. "I eat breakfast." "You drink coffee and stand at a window and call it breakfast." He looked at her. She looked back at him without apology, with the calm directness of a woman who has decided, somewhere between last night and this morning, that she is done making herself smaller in this particular kitchen. He said, "What would you recommend?" And she turned to the stove with something that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood, and began to cook, and he sat at the counter and watched her hands and did not look away. It was almost enough to make him forget. Then Tomas appeared in the doorway. "Boss." His voice carried the specific quality of someone interrupting something they would rather not interrupt but have no choice. "The Rafael Cuesta matter. He's available this afternoon. If you still want the meeting." Federico went still. Rafael. R. The lead he had been pursuing. The rival he had constructed from a single initial and his own fear. He looked at Beatrice. She was at the stove, her back to him, unaware of what was happening behind her. The slightly wilted roses were on the counter beside her, waiting for water. "Set it up," Federico said, and walked out. Beatrice stood at the stove and listened to his footsteps recede down the corridor, and the kitchen, which had been warm for 20 minutes, was simply a kitchen again. The meeting with Rafael Cuesta lasted 11 minutes. Rafael was 28 years old, mildly terrified of Federico Grover, and had never heard the name Beatrice Harvey in his life. He confirmed this with the transparent sincerity of a man who understood that lying to the person across the table from him was not a viable survival strategy. Federico dismissed him before the coffee arrived. He sat in the empty meeting room afterward. Alone. Tomas appeared in the doorway. He did not say "I told you so," because he was a professional. But he sat down across from Federico, and looked at him with the patience of a man who has been waiting for a specific conversation to become possible. "It was you," Tomas said. Quietly. Not a question. Federico looked at the table. The order form. The cancellation. The handwriting. Tomas paused. "You ordered the flowers in December. You got scared and cancelled them. And then the florist's error delivered them anyway." Federico's voice was flat. "And I took them from her hands." The meeting room held the words. "She's going to leave," Federico said again. It was the second time he'd said it, and it carried more weight than the first. "You keep saying that," Tomas said. "But you haven't asked her." Federico looked up. "You haven't told her the truth," Tomas said. "You've investigated a ghost, confronted a man who had nothing to do with anything, and sat in this room. You haven't actually done the one thing that could change how this ends." He stood. "For a man who solves problems for a living, boss, you are being remarkably creative about avoiding this one." He left. Federico sat alone in the meeting room for a long time. He thought about his father, the photograph on his desk, the lesson inherited like a wound. Tenderness is a liability. What you love can be used against you. He had carried that teaching for 30 years, built an empire on its logic, and called it wisdom. He thought about Beatrice in the kitchen window. Her face tilted toward the pale winter sun. The hum that lived in the room before she knew anyone was listening. The way she had said, "Those were mine." Not shouting, not crumbling, just stating a truth with the quiet authority of someone who knew their own worth even when the room was trying to argue otherwise. He thought about do not redeliver. Do not contact. His own handwriting, his own fear, codified and submitted to a florist in January because he could not bear to want something and admit it. He thought about what it meant that the flowers had arrived anyway. He stood up. He walked through the estate toward the kitchen, and this time there was no hesitation in his stride. Not the hesitation of a man who has made a decision, but the particular forward movement of a man who has stopped running from one. She was there. Tuesday night prep, same as the week before. The kitchen warm, the lighting low, her hands moving through the familiar choreography of work she knew completely. She looked up when he entered. Read something in his face that made her set down what she was holding. "Mr. Grover." He stopped in the center of the kitchen. His hand moved toward his cufflink, once, twice, and then deliberately he lowered it. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I need you to let me finish before you say anything." Beatrice waited. "The flowers," he said. "They were from me." He told her everything. Not smoothly. Federico Grover was fluent in authority and strategy and the precise language of power, but this was a different kind of fluency, one he had not exercised, and it showed. He told her about December, about the website open on his laptop, about the order placed under a name that wasn't his because his own name felt too exposed. He told her about the panic 6 days later, the cancellation, the notation he had written with a hand that was steadier than he felt. He told her about the florist's error, about seeing the flowers in her arms and knowing, in the first half-second, before the fear arrived, exactly what they were. And then choosing fury over truth. Beatrice listened. Her face moved through its own sequence. Disbelief first, the slight narrowing of eyes that meant she was testing what she was hearing against what she knew. Then something harder. Anger, arriving not loudly but with a particular weight of something that had been building for longer than one morning. "You took them from my hands, Federico." His name. First time. He absorbed it like the physical thing it was. "You made me feel like I had done something wrong. In this house. In front of everyone." Her voice did not waver. "Do you understand what it is to work in a place every day and feel like you don't exist? And then for one morning, to feel like someone actually saw you. And then to have that taken." He stood and received it. Every word. He did not deflect. He did not manage or redirect or apply the pressure that was his habitual response to discomfort. He stood in her kitchen and let her words land where they needed to land. "I know," he said. "That's why I sent them." The weight of that sentence occupied the kitchen completely. Beatrice looked at him for a long time. This man, diminished in this moment, not by weakness but by honesty, which required a different and rarer kind of strength, was someone she had not seen before. And because she had spent 14 months learning to read the truth beneath Federico Grover's surfaces, she recognized what she was looking at. Not performance, not management, not the carefully constructed presentation of a man in control. Just a man. Terrified. Telling the truth for possibly the first time in years. She reached for the bouquet on the counter. Drew out one rose. Deep red, slightly past its peak, honest in its imperfection, and placed it on the counter between them. "You nearly ruined this," she said. Quietly. Without cruelty. Just truth. "I know," he said. "Don't do that again." 4 words. A warning and an opening simultaneously. A door she was choosing, with full knowledge of its weight, to leave unlocked. He reached out. Slowly, with the care of a man who understands he is handling something that has already been damaged once by his own hands. His fingers straightened the stem of the rose she had placed between them. His hand grazed hers. She did not move away. Outside, the February night was cold and indifferent to everything occurring in the Grover kitchen. Inside, something was beginning. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of things that have been true for longer than either party has been willing to admit. 3 weeks later, the estate had the same marble floors and the same vaulted ceilings and the same iron fencing and the same cold February light that had by now tipped into the pale beginning of March. Everything looked the same. Nothing was. Federico ate breakfast now. Every morning at the kitchen counter, on the stool that had become, by silent mutual agreement, his. Beatrice worked and they talked, about nothing important, about everything real. Tomas observed this new configuration with profound satisfaction and said nothing, which was his highest form of approval. On the kitchen windowsill, the bouquet, fully dried now, the roses holding their deep color in their desiccated form, stood in a vase beside the unauthorized rosemary. The single rose Beatrice had placed between them on that night lived in a smaller vase, closer to where she stood when she worked. Federico had noticed. He had never mentioned it. One morning he left something on the kitchen counter before she arrived. A book, The kind she had mentioned once in passing, as something she'd always meant to read. Attached to it was a post-it note in his precise handwriting. "I thought you'd like this. F. No code. No fake name. Just the initial, honest and unambiguous. Offered without the protection of anonymity or the escape route of plausible deniability." Beatrice stood in the kitchen doorway holding the book and reading the note 3 times. Then she placed the post-it in her apron pocket, beside the card that still lived there, "For the woman who makes this house feel like something," and began her morning. Tomas found Federico in the main corridor, watching through the kitchen doorway as Beatrice moved through her work, unhurried and warm and entirely herself. "You know, boss," Tomas said almost to himself, "for a man who cancels things, you're not very good at letting go." Federico said nothing, but his right hand, which had been moving toward his cufflink, stilled. And stayed still. In the kitchen, Beatrice began to hum. It was the same hum from the first morning. Low, unhurried, private. The sound of a person who has remembered that they are allowed to take up space. Federico stood in the corridor and listened to it, and he did not announce himself, and he did not walk away. He stood in the doorway of a warm kitchen on a cold morning, and let himself have the thing he had almost destroyed with his own 2 hands. Then he stepped inside. Pride will always whisper that love is a threat. It is almost always wrong. And for those rare, fortunate souls brave enough to ignore that whisper, even late, even imperfectly, even after they have already made a mess of it, the door, remarkably, has a way of remaining open.